I promise you, once you read the book, you'll clap a lot louder and a lot harder. Hardayal ji, what a pleasure. I'm sure you need no introduction. You know him from his almost 4 decades in public service as Chief Commissioner of Income Tax. He's been the Ombudsman in the Income Tax Department. He's written more than 70 articles in various publications, been an author. And what a fascinating read. I had the privilege of Sir sending me this book a few weeks ago. So I had good time to read it cover to cover. Oftentimes we have these conversations when one is just quickly glance through the book in a few hours. And it's a very touching, poignant, understandable read. Ladies and gentlemen, when I was a student and I incidentally studied ethics in university in England, and the basis of morality goes on to ethics. Ethics becomes the basis of law, and law becomes the basis of civilization. In understanding these moral dilemmas, which is a modern day Amra Chitra Katha, and that's the best way to describe this book for you and me, and the way it has been done is totally staggering. Hardayal ji, now you already mentioned why you've written this book. For an introduction to an audience who's perhaps not yet read it, what are they expecting? You know, there are stories which are very brief, but tell a very interesting point. How have you selected them? Have they been from anecdotal evidence, from life experience? How did you come across these stories, sir?
Thank you very much, Rishabh, for those very kind words. But I wouldn't expect anything less from somebody with whom I share the same alma mater. So thank you very much once again. But now to answer your question, you see, these books, these stories are real life stories. Some of them I knew only in part. So part I had to imagine depending upon the character of the person. Some actually happened. Some are extremely well known, like what happened in the case of our former president, Dr. Abdul Kalam. Then there are some stories which relate to some friends of mine, there are 3 from the Central Vigilance Commission itself, where I worked for about 6 years. And then there are stories about, which were narrated to me but didn't have a conclusion. So I had to find a conclusion depending upon the character of the person. It took me 10 years to write this book. First time I wrote it, it was rejected because they said, it's too philosophical, it's too academic, nobody's going to read it, nobody's got the time these days.
Yeah, Hardayal ji, some of the stories, and that's all. Every chapter is an anecdote giving you a moral lesson from something you can totally relate to in your workplace, in how you live. But there are some chapters, for example, in chapter 1, you're drawing a conclusion, right? A person does the right thing by not hiring someone who's about to betray his former company, even though he loses his own job because of that, but it ends in a happily ever after. But in the second one, which I don't want to allude where that example is coming from, but the story is, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but there is a person who's helping out a former very senior colleague who's suffering from an illness by breaking the rules, and gets into trouble for breaking the rules. That particular story doesn't have either a happy ending or even a clear ending. It represents the moral dilemmas.
It represents moral dilemmas, but if you read carefully, Rishabh, it does have a moral and it does have a happy ending, because the person who committed the wrong gets let off with a warning. And that's also real life. He got off with a warning. Only any other person would have been accused of fraud. But he got off with the warning because he was, very well connected, very powerful.
So in the reasons the rules are made, because laws are made on the assumption of the worst case scenario, that everyone who appears will be either lying or be a criminal. So every detail, today if you go to a court of law, you have to appear before a registrar to even verify your own signature physically, because they think you can even fake that. So they are made on the basis of criminality, or the assumption of criminality, or assumption of defeat. But in a case, you are arguing that there is a room for interpretation through moral compass on whether the intention was right or wrong.
That I basically leave to the reader. You see, if you read that story carefully, you can come to more than one conclusion. People who are sticklers for rules, regulations, and laws will say that these people should definitely have been punished. Because simply because if they're not punished, you're setting a bad example in an organization. But then if you look at it, the law itself was absurd, it had become outdated, the rule was antiquated, in other words. The government lost nothing. All that was done was that the due procedure was not followed, and the persons who helped this gentleman who was sick, their old professor, was simply that, you see, if we do not, he says, if we cannot help somebody, you know, we are not violating any fundamental rule as such. We are only they only could be accused of violating procedure. There was no financial loss to the government.
When the procedure itself was, you know, deeply troubling because...
that is the problem in the government, with something which all of us should ponder over, particularly those who are running the government today, that you see, rules do not keep pace with ground realities. Ground realities change too quickly.
So, Hardayal ji, is there something to be said? I'll give you a small example, that today when we, and the ruling establishment talks about this often, that today when you're submitting a document before a bank or a government or anyone, you can sign it yourself. You don't need a gazetted officer, such as the roles that you've served in, to come and authenticate to you. This assumption of procedure simplifying on the basis of trust, a government or a establishment trusting either its employees, an organization trusting its employees, and its people. How difficult is this? It's not always easy.
You see, it's very difficult, Rishabh, in a society such as ours, which is basically a low trust society. What is the government has done, I think this is, I'm glad you brought up this point actually. This is one major reform which has been undertaken in recent times. Basically what it does is, you don't have to go to a gazetted officer, you attest your own documents. If they turn out to be, if you're attesting wrongly, certainly you can be prosecuted, or action can be taken against you. But the initial faith, the initial move to create trust has been taken by the government. And I think that's a good step.
But in a practical way, I'll give you an example. Let's say you work in an organization and the organization provides you free stationery. Okay, there's a pen and paper here. But there is one person who always steals the stationery. Therefore, the stationery is no longer provided and other people lose out. Now, these are conundrums that exist for leaders, for management, as well as for those people who are working in organizations, big, large, government or otherwise.
Yeah, well, my advice, or based on my experience, I mean, I could be wrong. My experience is that trust begets trust. Normally, even amongst friends and relatives, you see, the point is, how does human nature work? You see, if you are living in a low trust society, that creates higher costs. If you are living in a society in which you trust, actually in the long run, even if some people steal, it doesn't matter. It would, in the long run, the organization will benefit. You see, what happens is, I'll give you a simplest example. It's what's called altruistic, reciprocal altruism. That is, if I smile at you, or even if you smile at a baby, the natural response is to smile back. Why should we think otherwise? Now, if somebody betrays your trust, it'll happen in one case out of 100. Now, how much has the government lost, I ask you, but through this one reform? Or let's say, do we stop saying that we will not issue checks just because some people issue fraudulent checks? There will be some people, 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, who are prone to it. You take action against them. But you don't spoil a system. Barely, because in India, I think the problem is the system got spoiled because there was this, it comes from colonial times, and the colonial masters haven't had no trust in the natives.
But okay, so the chapter, of course, is entitled "The Difficulty of Being Good," which incidentally, Gurcharan ji, who's written the foreword for this book, wrote a book which is an excellent read as well. Yeah. So let's come back to the story that you mentioned, in which I was discussing with you earlier. Satish Dhawan, ladies and gentlemen, one of the pioneers of India's space program. Satish Dhawan Space Center in Sriharikota is named after him. Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, all of you know. They work together. Now here, I'm assuming is an anecdote that you heard, which is roughly to what happened. Sir.
No, I heard him. I heard Dr. Kalam give this. I heard it from his own mouth, the whole story.
Okay, so what can we share with the audience without giving away all the books, sir?
Look, I'll say this much. Even if you read Peter Drucker, right, with which many of you must have read many books by him or articles. What does he say? Basically, I'll just take half a minute if you
please.
You see, at the lower levels of an organization, the work tends to be repetitive. You move one step higher in an organization at the first supervisory level. In any organization, government, public sector, private sector, it becomes technical. Either you're a marketing executive, sales executive, HRD, whatever. The higher you go, you have to depend, you reach a level where you realize, when you reach middle management, you realize for the first time that, look, my efforts can only get me this far. I have to depend on other people for my success. Now, how do I win their trust and their wholehearted cooperation? To do that, I have to be humble. They must see me as one of them. If I'm too aloof a figure, and that is the problem with a lot of people, people who lead organizations, and particularly politicians, they get out of touch with ground reality.
I think M.K. Gandhi, great example, right? I mean, look at, ladies and gentlemen, today traveling to London, studying in England is a very expensive proposition. You had Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi doing that 120, 130 years ago. The issue that happened in Peter Maritzburg was because he was in first class. Not many of us travel first class. So he came from certain privilege. And when he comes back to India, he realizes that I need to be exactly this one with the masses, otherwise how do I represent them? And the very famous comment, I'm told, by Sarojini Naidu, that it costs us a fortune to keep you in poverty, was done. So
that's right.
In this example, just to come back, where basically you are saying that when something went wrong, Satish Dhawan came and took the flak for it. Yeah. But when something went right, he said, Dr. Kalam, you go take the credit.
He told Dr. Kalam very unobtrusively, you know more about this, the project than I do.
This is India's first rocket launch.
India's first rocket launch. Why don't you go and take the press conference? The press is outside. That is when it succeeded. When it failed, he says, I'm glad. Even then he didn't blame him. He said, I'm glad you told me all the facts. I think I can explain it to the press.
Okay. Our time is short. So, at what point of time, Hardayal ji, did you think that?
By the way, just call me Hardayal.
Yeah. that we need, for people of a different age and stage to re-examine these moral stories, which perhaps we've let go. They are short stories in the end. They're all independent short stories, but working towards a theme that we need. The people sitting here and the people watching this need something like this, to help refocus their conundrums which we face on a daily basis.
Well, Rishabh, I'll say only this much. This book doesn't have, as you would have seen yourself, doesn't have any instant solutions. There's no instant coffee in life.
Yeah.
You see, the idea is to help people focus on their problems, introspect, and find their own solutions, based on good conscience. But, you and I may have good conscience, but we may be perfectly valid. I mean, one doesn't, there cannot be anything dogmatic about what is right and what is wrong. It depends on the context, the person, the situation.
Do we spend less time in that little bit of introspection that perhaps is required? Because let's face it, everything is happening so fast, and I've seen it, that it just gets out of control so rapidly. I mean, I work in a news place, social media, somebody says one thing, somebody said required, and by the time anybody can even apply their minds to what's going on, it's become very extreme or very highly charged. what would your advice be in sometimes in difficult things, taking a step back just to think what you're writing, think what you're saying?
I think the important thing to do is to set aside 15, 20 minutes or half an hour if you can, every day, if not every day, every few days, and just go through what you have done and see for yourself, ask yourself, have I done the right thing? If there are one or two tests for this. One is that you can, if you look yourself in the mirror, can you look yourself straight in the mirror and not blink? You know, if you are going to lower your eyes, that means there's something which you've done wrong. The second thing is, you can, if you like, go through a small checklist before you take, if you have the time. Ask yourself 3 questions. What I'm doing, is it legal? Legal means it should be in accordance. That is what we mean by law, in a very broad sense. Rules, regulations, conventions, everything. If it's not, I think you should drop it then and there. The second thing is, you should ask yourself, is it fair? Like if if I'm doing something for an employee, if another employee who's equally placed, will I be able to do it for him? The third thing is, ask yourself the question, am I comfortable with it? Is it really according with my conscience? If it's not, there may be something wrong. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but it could be legal, it could be fair. I mean, in the sense that it would pass off, the world will not bother about it, but something is bothering you inside. You should find out what that is. This is especially when you take big ticket decisions, decisions with humongous costs.
So, my question was exactly that when one is being expected to respond instantaneously and take decisions very, very quickly. I mean that's advice I could take into my profession, right? Something has happened, all right? It is almost impossible to verify and check in the next few minutes. Okay, it's almost impossible because the process to do it beyond reasonable doubt is going to be difficult.
Is it fair to all concerned?
Should it be reflective that if I am unable to decide, and I am saying in generic terms, that I should sound clear and confident even if I am not? It's a tough one.
It's a tough one. I think it will have to depend on the person concerned. Sometimes you can be diffident even when you're right. And
yes.
Sometimes you can be very cocky and confident when you're wrong. So there cannot be any clear answer to that. But introspection is always helpful, is always useful. Even if you do it after the event, it can help you prevent similar mistakes in future. That's all.
Last couple of questions, sir. In learning these kind of lessons, then the old axiom or aphorism applies that don't only learn from your mistakes, learn from the mistakes of others. In observing what has happened around you, that you maybe if you're, like I said, a junior employee, you're starting off, but you're observing things going right and wrong. My always advice is to young employees is see what your immediate HODs do and do that better, and see what they think you do, what they do wrong, and improve upon it when you're in that position, and eventually you will be. So, how do you learn from others?
Again, the answer is the same. You see, there are 2-3 ways you can improve your judgment. Judgment will improve through vast reading. You see, you can learn from your own experience. You can learn from the experience of others, and that is possible not only from the lived experience.
Yeah.
Right? So you can improve yourself by reading widely. So that way you'll be familiar with many more situations than what you are in your own limited life. So read widely, introspect, and occasionally contemplate own decisions, and ask yourself that if the same thing, let's say, one test could always be published tomorrow, or if Rishabh or his other team of anchors were to announce it on NewsX, would I be proud of it or ashamed?
Good point. Hardayal ji, where does it go from here? So I'm sure these are not the only stories to tell. I'm sure there are a lot more. What are you thinking and what are you planning next?
Well, you see, the thing is, I will write a book again, hopefully. I'm 75 years old, but time permits, I'd like to make another effort. But I'm always convinced, I always feel that one should write only when you have some insights which you want to share. You see, you don't write anecdotes for the sake of, just telling a story. The point is, you should also be sharing your own experience through those stories. You must be trying to, whatever you write should also contain a message. Something which has worked for me, I want to say that, look, it's worked for me. Maybe it might work for you also.
Following the axiom that write only when you have something to say. That's fair enough.
And one last thought I'd like to leave behind. There is one story in this book where the protagonist comes out on top after a long struggle. But I think what sums up his entire journey, his entire travel through good times, difficult times, is that you get in life what you put into it. Thank you.
You reap what you sow. Hardayal ji, as always, a pleasure. For those of you who have not read the book, it's a collection of short stories. They're very easy to read. So anybody from young to our age to older can have a go at it, and they make you think. They make you just stop. This is not about just purely flowery language. This is about just sharing. And I'm going to end with what I started. If there was a modern day Amra Chitra Katha, okay, for people in our age and stage, this is probably it. Hardayal ji, pleasure to have been and finally to have gotten the chance to do this. I know this has been long pending. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.